At its very core, drug science must remain independent. This means we don't accept sponsorships. It's with the support of the drug science community we're able to do this and make the podcast in the first place. If you're able to become a drug science community member and support the show, you too will be supporting the dissemination of evidence-based drug policies. Without you, none of this would be possible. For anybody interested, there's a link in the show notes. Thank you. Hello and welcome to the Drug Science Podcast with me, David Nutt. Here we're bringing together experts and activists for a rational, honest and informed conversation about drugs.
Welcome to the Drug Science Podcast, everybody, with me, Jo Neal. Today we have two very, very special guests. Two women who are instrumental in setting up the charity group Anyone's Child, Families for Safer Drug Control. Anyone's Child is a network of families who have been negatively affected by drug laws. In fact, their lives changed forever because of our punitive drug laws directly affecting and hurting their families. A while ago, I did a couple of events with Anyone's Child up in Manchester, and I was extremely impressed by the hard work of the Transform team led by Jane Slater and the strength, compassion and bravery of the parent members and activists. It's an experience I will never forget. I met Ray Lakeman from the Isle of Man, who lost both his sons, Jacques and Torren, to an overdose of ecstasy, 6 times the lethal dose, in the same night when they came to watch Man United play at Old Trafford. Most of us are lucky enough to never have experienced this loss, grief, heartbreak that has changed the lives of these parents forever. And that could be any one of us as parents of children who grow into teenagers, adults who've ever taken drugs. Of course, not just our children, but our partners, family members, indeed anybody, our friends. I guess many of us will not experience the grief that has been experienced by, we're lucky enough, by the Anyone's Child family members. So today's guests are Jane Slater, who's the Deputy Chief Executive Officer at Transform Drug Policy Foundation. She co-founded and now she leads the Anyone's Child campaign. We also have Anne-Marie Cockburn with us today. In 2013, her 15-year-old daughter, Martha Fernbach, spent the afternoon in an Oxford park with friends where she took 0.5 gram of 91% pure ecstasy. She died 3 hours later from an ecstasy overdose, an accidental ecstasy overdose. Since then, Anne-Marie has searched the world for answers and tirelessly campaigned to raise awareness and to push for badly needed changes to drug policy. Anne-Marie is a founding member of Anyone's Child. So thank you so much, both of you, for joining us here on the Drug Science Podcast. So I'd like to start with you, Jane, and asking you a bit about your background, how you came to kind of have this dream job of working with Transform, and then to go on and tell us all about Anyone's Child. So very warm welcome to both of you.
Thank you very much, Jo, and thanks for that introduction. So yeah, I'm Jane. I have been working at Transform now for nearly 16 years, slightly unbelievably. How I first got to Transform, well, to be honest, I was looking around a volunteering centre and saw a little leaflet for Transform Drug Policy Foundation, and it piqued my interest. I was in my mid-20s and I was looking to sort of pursue a career in something that I felt would help change the world. And to be honest, I'd had 2 experiences. One, I'd done some teaching in India as part of a gap year. I'm obviously quite privileged. And where I was living was a major hash producing region, which also had the death penalty for various drug offences. And in a very short time after, I lived in Amsterdam, which obviously has a much freer approach to drugs. So I had these 2 experiences in my early 20s that made me start to think it's really interesting that you've got different drug policies, but not necessarily in Amsterdam, I'd been a student there, and I'd very much witnessed a lot of the students who I was studying alongside, who had a very sort of sensible, pragmatic approach to drugs, which was very different to my English counterparts. Anyway, I had these array of experiences, and they just led me to sort of question why drug policy is the way it is. But I think I came at the issue kind of from a bit of an intellectual perspective. It was part of my studies, that was just something interesting to look at. And it's really only working at Transform. I then did a master's in international development whilst working at Transform as their administrator, that I got really, really interested in the production issues and the sort of international perspective of it. And it's since setting up Anyone's Child, I think, that I've become really a very passionate and deeply committed campaigner on this issue, because I've just met so many wonderful people who have been so tragically and unnecessarily impacted by this failing policy.
What was your sort of educational background?
Well, I was at Manchester University studying geography, so that's where I came at it. If I go into at Transform Drug Policy, I always just thought, well, if we present the evidence on this, surely drug policy flips. I'd looked at sort of all sorts of international issues like climate change or, international poverty. And to be honest, I felt quite stuck on what the solutions were. Whereas I looked at drug policy and I thought, well, if you just change the laws around this, what a difference that would make. So for me, it felt like quite a manageable campaign to take on, even if I've learned it's a lot more complicated than that in the last 16 years working here. But yeah, I think initially I thought, gosh, this is all about presenting the evidence. And then having sat in an office surrounded by evidence, having looked at this issue from so many different perspectives, met the police officers who said, this policy is unenforceable, the health professionals who said, look at what we're picking up, and all the people who seem to get anywhere close to this issue going, surely it doesn't work. What I think clicked was, this is about something more than evidence. We need to really look at how we make people care about drug policies. We need to change hearts and minds. We need to, at probably its very saddest level, is remind people that people who use drugs are human, which has always actually depressed me as a bit of a goal of Anyone's Child. But I tragically still think we need to continue to do that. And it was this changing hearts and minds that was critical to what Anyone's Child was trying to achieve. And then one day I received a phone call from Anne-Marie.
So have you two have known each other then 15 years or so?
Hi, it's Anne-Marie.
Hello, Anne-Marie. Anne-Marie, and introducing Anne-Marie here. Very, very warm welcome to the podcast, Anne-Marie. It's such a privilege for us to have you on.
Yeah. Jane and I met because after Martha died, I was looking for answers and support and help, and I found Transform's details, and I just phoned up, and Jane answered the phone that day. And I said what had happened and that I wanted to know more, and we took it from there. So we met in Oxford, where I live. Danny Kushlik and Jane came along, and just slowly we kind of started to sort of talk, and I spoke about Martha and my experience. I took them to my home, and they could see all Martha's things, her bike outside the house. I took them to the spot where Martha died by the lake. I think it was from there that Jane has said that they went home and left me there and thought, we've got to do something about this. This can't be how it is. Because people like me, we experience our worst fear happening. I was a single mother. I went home to an empty home. I walked past Martha's bedroom door. Her crumpled bed was laid there, unmade. I knew, that was it. And I just had to get on with my life. But I needed to put the agony, and I needed to put the love I still had for her. I needed to channel it somewhere. And it's been a real learning curve for someone in my shoes and for the other families involved in Anyone's Child. So that's kind of how Jane and I met.
And really, I think our listeners will really want to hear more about you, Anne-Marie, and more about Martha, and sort of So anyone's child then really grew from that one kind of meeting between you two.
Yeah, I think that was, I think it was an idea within Transform that we needed to look at how we changed hearts and minds, and we knew there was a need for a campaign, but it was also something we knew was such a sensitive area to sort of go to, that we wanted to make sure that we were very authentic and sensitive in the way we covered that. And I think meeting Anne-Marie really brought that home. As you say, I've got a really clear memory of standing on the train station with Danny after having met Anne-Marie, and the two of us were sort of frozen there going, we can't go back to Anne-Marie's house because we've just left it, but we also feel like we've left it. Someone's so in such a fragile state that it felt irresponsible to leave her, but we were sort of stuck there on this platform. I don't know how else to describe it than that, just aware of what she'd been through and what an important voice that was for people to hear.
Absolutely. So I think, Anne-Marie, now is probably a good time for our listeners to hear, from you, your personal story, a bit about your background maybe, and then about Martha and kind of what's happened since.
I'm from Ayrshire in Scotland, and I moved to Oxford in 1990 for a change of scene, and just had family members in the south and loved it. And I just thought I could just make a life for myself here. I had Martha in 1997. I was 26 at the time. In fact, if she was still alive, she would have turned 26 last week. So that was quite a moment in the history of this. I was a single mother from when she was about 10 months old, and she was just such a lovely, easy child, and such a joy to sort of, guide through her life. And then I guess when she got to about 13, you get the usual kind of teenage sort of resentment, rebellion, push away from sort of any authority.
Oh, yes, I've been there. 2 daughters. Oh, yes.
Yeah, the mind games girls can play as well. But she was a funny, loving child, despite also, her trying to sort of work things out for herself a little bit with her friendship group and with the pressure of school and so on. So I could tell that she was starting to be quite secretive, and there was just a few bits of her behaviour where I was like, something's kind of happening here. But we had open dialogue in our house, and when I suspected she might be sort of dabbling a bit, I sat her down, confronted her, and I expected a big argument, and I expected her to deny it, but she told me the truth straight away. And I was really,
Oh, lovely. That's the strength of your relationship.
I was shocked because I thought
I'll bet.
I wasn't prepared for that, so therefore I didn't really know what to say to her when she told me she had taken ecstasy and she had had a nice experience and it made her feel happy. And I sort of shouted at her saying, "Hey, you're not happy then?" And she said, "Yeah, but it makes me feel even happier." I said, "So happy is not enough. Even happier than happy is what you're striving for." So I just wasn't equipped to know how to kind of respond to her, how to help her at that stage in her life. So I did the old Nancy Reagan just say no kind of thing, because that's all I knew. That's all I'd been taught. I was born in 1971, where a lot of this kicks off in respect of some of the sort of 1971 Misuse of Drugs Act came in. So for my whole life, all the tabloids have been feeding into the psyche of, the posters of what a drug user looks like, the type of families who have members who take drugs and whatever. So, 5 decades on, it would be 4 decades on at that point, but when Martha and I sat down and had that discussion, all I did was take her into school the next day, try to get them to shame her into not doing it again. I wasn't listening to her. I wasn't asking her, what's it like to be her? What's going on in your life? What are you getting to see that I didn't get to see in my teenage years? It wasn't an open discussion that, looking back now, I could have, I'm not going to blame myself too much what happened, but...
No, I think, Anne-Marie, that's an example of how much damage that the so-called war on drugs has done to all of us. That perception that people shouldn't take drugs, rather than if they are going to take drugs, they should be kept safe. And so many people I talk to are the same, oh no, you can't regulate drugs because they're all bad,
Yeah, so I was searching for good information. I was really looking, and I went on the Frank website, and it just says, oh, it's a fad. It didn't give me any information about a child that was taking drugs, what I could do about that. It was just saying, it gave me descriptions of the drugs and the effects. It didn't give me anything to do with harm reduction whatsoever. I always said for years, don't talk to Frank, because I spoke to Frank and it was far from adequate. After Martha died, I found that she'd been looking on the Lancet for ways to take ecstasy safely. Yeah. So she was looking for good information, and I was looking for good information.
Yeah. And that just information just was not available at that time.
It's a prohibition on harm reduction and parents like me. So that's why I talk out about this. I want to empower other parents. There are many parents in my position now wanting that good information, wanting to have a grown-up, really well-informed discussion with their adolescent. And yeah, this is harder. Talking about my child in the past tense is a lot harder than trying to have a dialogue about taking drugs, But to me, I see it no different to age-appropriate sex education. It's about equipping them with good information so they can make informed choices. So I just see it in that way.
I love a quote of yours, actually. As a pharmacologist, this is a brilliant quote, Anne-Marie. The difference between a poison and a medicine is dose.
Yeah, because Martha had survived it before. She had done it 3 times before, as far as I know. And this time at the time, I think there was a lot of PMMA going around. So she knew about that. So she had sourced very well in that way, and got a very pure crystalline version, which she pounded down into a powder. But what she didn't know, it was 91% pure, and she should have taken an awful lot less than the last time, and that would have been okay to get her home safely that day, and it would be a very different discussion now. But she didn't know that, so she took the whole 0.5 gram in one go. And like Ray's story with his sons taking 6 times the sort of recommended dose, I've been told it was 5 to 10 times the recommended dose. And Martha was a very slight frame as well, so that would have obviously counted in respect to recommended dosage for her.
This is in spite of her trying to learn as much as she could about the drug she was taking. And of course, unregulated market, there is no checks and balances like when you're buying, as we know, drugs from the pharmacy. So what we need is drug checking, regulated supplies. So
yeah, we also need to be able to, with that type of framework, we would then be able to have really good discussions in schools, educational settings. At the moment, it is very much, it could be this or it could be that. And, that's why the drug testing that's available at the moment is just so reassuring for somebody in my shoes. But Martha wasn't a massive risk taker, despite what this sounds like. She was the kind of child that, talked to her girlfriends about, contraception. She would take them on the bus up to the sort of that department at the hospital so they could talk to the nurses about, that stage that they were at. Martha had a boyfriend. She took her boyfriend to the doctor with her. They spoke to the doctor together. She was such an extraordinary little person. She wasn't a risk taker, but she was certainly somebody of her time. She was seeing what was going on in her life, and she was wanting to be a part of that.
Absolutely. And she has the right to be safe.
Yeah. Martha did not leave my house on that Saturday morning with a plan to overdose, for sure. She was just about to have our school holidays with her friends, the whole summer ahead of her. Yeah, and that was my reality. She left, and all that came back were her Converse trainers in her bag from the police. And it's like, there you go, Anne-Marie, get on with your life and just pretend nothing's happened.
So I sort of wanted to touch on grief a little bit. I mean, you say it's, of course, it's a cruel and powerful motivator. I heard an interview with Nick Cave recently. Louis Theroux was interviewing him, the poet and author and rock star. I don't know if he'd like to hear that said about him, but he's lost two sons, died so tragically. But I was really struck by him saying that him and his wife, they had to find a way to go on with life, but to still try and find the beauty and the joy in life, which I wondered what you thought about that.
Yeah, he's an amazing wordsmith and person, and I remember when he lost his son, it wasn't his young son. It was a similar time to Martha, I think. I subscribed to his Red Hand files, which are amazing. But he's got that ability to sort of, you think there's going to be an obvious answer, then he comes out with something very lyrical and very beautiful, and he's very generous, and despite the pain that he's in. And I guess in my own way, and the other families with Anyone Child, we are all trying to find beautiful, loving ways and creative ways to keep living and to not become angry and cynical. Because living beyond your worst fear happening, it's like no man's land. You're looking around, and you have to almost pretend that in order to function day to day, you have to pretend that they haven't died in a way. I had to just sometimes pretend it's as if she's gone to uni, I'm getting on with my life. Because if you really zone in on the reality of their absence and the details of it, you'd go mad. You would go mad. You would not be able to function. There's no way. So I'm lucky I'm 10 years on now, although I can recall it as if it was this morning it happened. But I've filled my life up with good people. I look after myself really well. I got married recently. Amazing
congratulations.
Man. And Martha showed it
Lovely.
when I was walking up the aisle waiting for me. And it was on the 10th anniversary of her death. And it's like me saying to the world, look what's possible despite it all. And I'm trying really hard to live a good life. And so far, I've made it to this moment, and I am doing well. But yeah, it would be amazing if it could be with Martha by my side, but it can't be that. So I've got to just accept that this has to be my version of normal. And yeah, I'm not cynical yet. So fingers crossed that's not yet to happen to me.
And of course, you're doing so much great work with Anyone's Child. So how important has the connection been with the other Anyone's Child parents?
I guess it's that thing where we stand united, knowing what it was like that day, to get that news. And the shuddering shock of that still resonates amongst the group of families. We look over at one another, and there's that non-verbal just knowing behind our eyes. So there's such respect and poignancy amongst the group, but great determination as well, because our fear for others, keeps us with all of this, because we know that what's in place is far from adequate, and I can't rest for sure until things have been dealt with. I haven't even got Martha a gravestone yet, because until drug policy is sorted out, I've chosen not to have those words carved into her gravestone. That it will give me a context in a way for the gravestone being ordered if drug policy is sorted out. So on that day, I will sort it out. Yeah.
That's very interesting, and that seems like a really good idea.
It's a good symbol, but again, it's this kind of making meaning from some of the decisions that you've had to make. Yeah.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for sharing all that with us. Yeah, it's heartbreaking and very hard to listen to, but I am really struck by your strength and compassion and how the strength to move on, really, and to do the work that you're doing.
One thing that's quite interested me about the group is that I think quite a number of the parents who have chosen to become involved with Anyone's Child, I think a lot of them feel that they're doing what their child was trying to tell them about drug policy, and that's become a real motivator for a lot of people. Have said that to me independently within the group. I think that's kind of what they were trying to say, but it really took that happening and me researching for that penny to kind of drop about what they were saying. Anyway, I just think that's an interesting about the group. And we always say that the group, if anyone gets in contact with Anyone's Child, I'll always say that this isn't a group for support particularly. This is for people who want a campaign, which has always felt very important, because I, for example, am not qualified as a counsellor, and no one within Transform has that sort of support role and will always refer people to other places, but it's there for people who want to campaign. Yet that group has now been meeting, for 8 years? To say there's no support within that group would be totally not true, right? But people have sort of formed their own support within that. And I think for a lot of people who come along to the meetings that we hold 4 times a year, I think it's the time that they can just really remember their child and really talk in a way that even within some families, I don't think having those open conversations, I think they're just too painful, or, there are so many stigmas around this issue that, tragically lots of families, relationships often split at these incidents when families think different things, or, maybe someone wants the death to be recorded as the heart attack or something rather than as the drug. So you get all these complicating factors happening in these very tragic circumstances. And that's why I think the group is so powerful in that sort of support role. And I think that's what really, really does come out of it, is it, many people have described it as a family.
I was struck by that when I met the Anyone's Child parents in Manchester, that the sort of support for each other and the very different experiences that people had about how they were sort of managing, I think, coping and campaigning. So could you tell us a little bit about the work that Anyone's Child do then, the events that they run, the annual lobbying event in Parliament? Because I'm thinking that our listeners probably want to help some of our listeners and to get involved if they can.
Brilliant. Well, I think the campaign started out, and really the sort of key goal of it was to think about that how we're going to change the public narrative. We've got so many newspapers and populist magazines just pumping out nonsense on this issue. So we had a real drive at the beginning of trying to get in kind of unusual places. So Anne-Marie had a feature in Good Housekeeping very early on.
Oh, gosh.
Mail on Sunday, it's gone to Pick Me Up magazine, Take a Break, Closer magazines. It was really about getting out of our bubble. And so I think that was the first sort of real tranche of work that Anyone's Child family set about, was really, wonderful Rose, who again tragically lost 2 sons to heroin. She ended up on the Good Morning TV couch, having said she wasn't sure she'd really be up for doing much media. And so it was really about taking this conversation and to really sort of more mainstream spaces and trying to open up that debate and make people more aware of it. And we've continued to do that throughout the campaign. Again, Anne-Marie's been on Newsnight, which had over 10 million hits. These are
brilliant,
really big pieces in the media around the campaign. But I think the other real key strand of it is about how we alter the political conversation on this issue. So the campaign was launched back in 2015 by the families taking a petition to the then Prime Minister David Cameron. Funny that he should be back in politics again this week. But
yes,
that was an interesting one,
funny,
because we knew that back in 2002 he had appeared on a Home Affairs Select Committee and been quite open to the idea of regulating drugs. So it actually felt like we were at quite an important moment in this issue, because we had someone who we knew was on record as being quite supportive of reform. So we took along this letter, and we said in this letter we'd like a review of drug policy, and we will come back every year until this policy changes. And so now annually, around the 26th of June, which is the International Day against the United Nations sort of Drug Day, we go back to Parliament in ever greater numbers and encourage all our activists to go and meet with their MPs and see what they're saying. Because one of the really fascinating things about this issue is that we have supporters from every political party on this issue. Admittedly, it's not mainstream yet, but people of all sort of, whatever your political leaning, there's still an angle at which you might become engaged. And we realise for a lot of MPs, they either haven't thought about this issue or they're just quite scared of this issue. So actually those one-to-one meetings are really important and really effective of getting our MPs to, increasingly speak out. When we sort of started up this campaign, I would say we had very, very few MPs in support of reform. I mean, for years at Transform, it was, bless him, just Paul Flynn who would speak on the record of continuously champion this issue. In 2021, we ran a misuse of drugs. The Misuse of Drugs Act was 50 years old, and we ran a campaign around this. And as a result of that, 50 MPs stood up and said, we want a review of our current drug policy. And I would credit a lot of that change to the work of many of the families and activists who were part of the Anyone's Child network for that continuing pestering and writing these letters out, even though it's been quite, it hasn't been totally motivating for all of our activists, because not all of them have had the responses they want. But that just determination and going back and having those conversations, I think has been really, really effective. And again, I think it's for many MPs who were, they'd say to us behind closed doors, oh, I totally agree with you, but I'm not going to say that. I think the Anyone's Child families have switched that a little bit. Because it's no longer acceptable to say, I agree, but I'm not going to say that because I'm frightened for my career promotion, essentially. But also because standing with these families enables them to sort of test the water, I say quite cynically, and just say, look, I'm speaking for my constituent. And I think the more MPs we've watched do that, the more others have watched and gone, oh, that person still has a career, I'll speak out. And so I think it's really helping to move the wider debate in the right direction. And I think, I've been amazed by how impactful that has been.
I mean, to go from one MP to 50 MPs, able to speak out about the need for drug law reform is a phenomenal achievement. So just for our listeners, I think, just so they really understand, what is it that you're asking government to do? And for government listening.
So we are calling on the government to review current drug policy and for the legal control and regulation of the drugs market. So we want doctors, pharmacists, licensed retailers in control, not organised criminals, as currently the market is 100% controlled by.
So that's great. Thank you very much for our listeners. So that's a safe and regulated market.
And to be honest, we spent quite a long time when we were forming the campaign trying to think about what call would be the best. That is obviously the call of the Transform Drug Policy Foundation. But what we really felt that this was the call that united all of the stories. So, it was the one thing that would, whether you were a family in Colombia, whether your child had been imprisoned by drug policies, whether your child had tragically contracted HIV through injecting drug use, all these stories, the impacts could be altered through a regulated drug market. So it was our sort of most inclusive call, if that makes sense.
I know, absolutely. Yeah, it makes perfect sense. And Anyone's Child is an international organisation, Jane, is it now?
Yeah, so Anyone's Child's got chapters in various countries, including Kenya, Canada, America, or we've got partnerships with them and Belgium. And increasingly, we're having conversations all over the place. The truth is that many countries are tied with the same drug laws. And I think these stories and families are wanting to speak out to sort of try and change this. I'd like to talk about when we sort of formed this international coalition of families was back in 2016, when there was a major United Nations meeting to address drug policy, what was called the UNGAS, somewhat unsexily. And we formed a protest outside of the United Nations in that year and united all these families with this goal of demonstrating the global impact of drug policies. Now, at this meeting back in 2016, it was quite a critical year in drug policy because the Canadian government was starting to look at changing its approach towards what was a fentanyl and OxyContin crisis in the country at the time. And we went there with an amazing mum called Donna May, who was a campaigner and mum who'd lost her daughter in Canada a couple of years before we were there. And she joined with us to do a fair bit of work in advance of this meeting with the health minister and some key politicians around the need for reform. And when we were at that meeting, we'd done our protest and we were just actually in our Airbnb all making coffee one morning. And I got a phone call and they just said, get into the UN now. You need to get here in the next hour. And we all sort of excitedly got in a taxi wondering what on earth we were going to do. And it was the then health minister, Jane Philpott's sort of speech. And she stood on the stage and she said, she put up a picture of Jack's daughter, of Donna's daughter, Jack. And she did a speech that said, I've met with experts, I've met with politicians, I've met with, all sorts of stakeholders who are impacted by this issue. But I've heard from this mum, and this mother has convinced me that I must do better for drug policy in Canada. And as a result of that speech, we've now seen the legalization of cannabis in Canada, and we've seen a much more health-focused approach towards drugs within their policy. So that event has really spurred us on as a group, because I believe that families are, and the voices of families are absolutely 100% critical to flipping this issue. I think it is such a political and stigmatized issue that we need to hear from those most impacted. And I've now gone through and looked at a lot of other countries where we've watched significant shifts in drug policy. And when you really start to look back, for example, the decriminalisation of drugs in Portugal, again, there was a family member sat very near to the front row of that debate, who was sat there throughout, who ensured that the government wasn't going to say, let's just keep going with the same status quo. So I think that speaks to how pivotal these voices are within the debate and how much we need to keep hearing from people who have felt it.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. It's really interesting how much that does change the debate. I mean, it's not surprising, but I think it's very important to emphasize that personal experience that really can change the whole debate. So what do we do about UK government? How do we, change UK drug policy? Because we have the highest rate of drug-related deaths in Europe.
Well, I think it is we're in it for the long game, but I think we're doing the groundwork, aren't we, for wider change. One of the things we're doing at the moment is trying to take the conversation out all over the country for local events, just to say we need to have a conversation about the issue of drugs, and we try and call out key stakeholders in local areas, so members of the police, members of local drug services, health professionals, and we try and bring them all together to make the case for wider drug policy reform, for legal control and regulation, but also to pinpoint innovations that can happen tomorrow that would help to save lives. So I'm thinking things like expansion of drug safety testing, expansion of heroin-assisted treatment, decriminalisation of drugs, trying to have these kinds of conversations around overdose prevention centres is another one, and encouraging those stakeholders to just put in place these vital life-saving measures tomorrow, and then look at this wider debate for changing drug policy. And again, we're having some really good successes around where we can encourage some of that debate. So there were families who were present as part of the debate in the West Midlands when they put in place their diversion scheme. Similarly, many of the families supported Danny Ahmed when he was putting in place the Middlesbrough heroin-assisted treatment. And we constantly work with the Loop, an organisation in the UK trying to roll out drug safety testing, whether that's doing sort of media messaging from the parents around our support for such innovations. So for those who think, gosh, that's a long way away regulating the drug market, I think it's important we put these measures in place tomorrow. And so that's sort of short-term strategy. And again, I would just say, if anyone is interested in getting involved, we run an activist network that people can get in contact about and join, because we're constantly trying to form these events via activists who work locally and are interested in this issue, but also to encourage those meetings with MPs. Because as I say, you can't really predict on paper who is going to be interested in this issue. It's often surprised us who we found friends with within MP circles and who is interested. And also how really, I suppose, the other thing that struck me running this is just how many people are impacted and how few people actually talk about it. So, of course, you realise a lot of the MPs you're talking to, the stakeholders you're talking, they too have been impacted and feel very deeply about this need for reform.
Absolutely. And they must be hearing from their constituents who are impacted. There's so many people impacted, by our drug laws. And just for our listeners, to remind you that Danny Ahmed, we've done a podcast episode with Danny Ahmed about his heroin-assisted treatment project up in Middlesbrough and how successful that was. And we've also done podcast with Fiona Measham from The Loop, and they're just brilliant drug checking work and how they're now bringing that into city centres so badly needed. And interestingly, Jane, the recommendations, the changes that we could make now, those have been recommended by the Home Affairs Select Committee report on drugs, which of course came out in August. So those recommendations are there for government. Just if there's any ministers listening. But as you say, cross-party issues, there are a lot of ministers, MPs, very, very affected by this and keen to change things. We have to. Something I wanted to ask you about, Anne-Marie, is artwork. And I see that you have a Martha Mary Fernbach Art Prize, which sounded just a lovely initiative to me. My youngest is very arty. A good artist.
The idea was to have an annual prize that was for initially a local young person near where I lived who had been exploited or was vulnerable, deemed to be vulnerable, and to support them with art-based kind of trauma therapy by a local female trauma specialist, and for them to then have curated exhibition at the end of that year. So to sort of help them in their education, help support them in their sort of emotional needs, and for it to be something in Martha's name that felt so right in respect to the kind of character she was. The actual prize itself is a ceramic version of her Converse trainers, so the theme running through her shoes as ever, the permanent symbol of her absence. But it's now, and next week we've got the exhibition, and after that it'll be the fourth prize winner. So I want to expand it further for it to have an apprenticeship element and so on. In my head, I've always got loads of ideas, but I was thinking about county lines, looking at youth offending teams and trying to connect those children into some kind of apprenticeship scheme in Martha's name. But I've got an idea in a minute, so we'll have to see what I can do with that.
That is so good. And where is the exhibition?
It's in Oxford at a place called ArcT. Yeah.
So look out for that, then, listeners. That sounds really, really great.
And I think Anne-Marie's brought a lot of her creativity into anyone's world. Like, it was 100% your idea to put the T-shirts with the relations on the front of as a very powerful visual around when we stood as a group. So the idea of the black T-shirts with the white writing saying "my daughter," "my son," etc., which you always see at our lobbies. And I think, the idea of trying to incorporate art, I don't know if people have seen our forget-me-not flowers that have been made by the families who are members of Anyone's Child and some of our activists, and a lot have come from the Scottish Recovery Forum. And the idea is that we go and plant these flowers marking every life lost to drugs the year before, which is where the latest statistics are. And we take those to Parliament, we take those to events. And the idea of that was to create something quite beautiful for a subject that is so often illustrated in a very negative and bleak way. Like, look at any drug story that happens in the newspaper, it invariably has a picture of an enormous pile of drugs or needles or someone in a dark alley. It's always quite nasty imagery, and we're trying to switch that over to these quite beautiful, poignant, individually handmade flowers. And actually there have been a few newspaper articles with that as the lead.
Yeah, I think that's such a powerful message, and you came up with that then, Anne-Marie, somebody's son, somebody's daughter.
Well, I like to come up with simple ideas that require very little explanation. I mean, we stood outside Parliament with all those T-shirts. I could see members of the public walking past, and there was this serene respect that they were giving us. They didn't quite know why we had this in our T-shirts, but I think they could kind of work it out a little bit. Because the thing is, for the families to speak these words, it's so painful. Like my throat clenched even 10 years later, because in nature, it's kind of counterintuitive to the fact that I've had this child. She was almost 16, and now I'm saying this stuff that I don't want to say because it's true. But so that if you don't have to say things and the words on the T-shirt, then that saves us sometimes. But we also find a way to say it out loud because it's so horrendous that it has to be heard. And yeah, so we'll keep doing that any way we can.
And I have heard, like yourself, parents bravely speaking out. And it is so, so powerful. And the flowers, I think the flowers are just a lovely idea.
Yeah. And the other thing is there are so many families that have never spoken out that I just know but aren't ready. And some people, I've had, families who I've spoken to and have, sort of disappeared for a few years and then come back 3-4 years later and go, right, I'm ready now.
Yeah, I can imagine everybody's very different about the stage at which they would be ready, or maybe not ever, I can imagine.
I think the thing that makes me angry though, Jo, is sometimes I look at my inbox. I've got so many messages of desperation from people. I had a few, I just sort of collated a few the other day. I had a mother who'd lost her son to cocaine in August saying, where do I turn? People really are desperate. And, it saddens me. They come to me in some ways because I just get upset that there aren't other places more equipped to deal with that trauma need. I think we're very equipped for campaigning, but it really is sad. People who've been told, yeah, you can get some counselling, but you're not currently exhibiting as suicidal, so you have to wait a year for that. The number of stories like that I have really is sad and depressing about so much else, I think. And yeah, I suppose that's really me as running this campaign, is that how few places there are for people to turn, particularly when they are embroiled in the stigma of the issue.
Yes, that was the other thing I sort of learned, that the kind of usual reaction to people is not the same when you tell them that your child has been imprisoned or...
Well, it's all we know it's to do with shame. So I was embarrassed that Martha had started taking drugs as a teenager. I didn't tell any of my friends. I didn't know where to turn. And then after she died, the way she died, it was taken out of my hands and very publicly, relayed in the tabloid press with lots of inaccuracies. And that the shame of that was horrendous for a moment. But then there was nothing I could do about it. And they kind of did me a favour, because I thought, am I allowed to swear?
Yes, right.
I thought, fuck you. You don't know my family. You don't know my child and what she meant to me and how I brought her up. And that was the moment when I thought, okay, it's out there. There's nothing I can do about it. But I will find a way to have my words relayed, and they will be accurate, and I'll represent my child. I'm not going to be shamed into the darkness like I had been before when she had just been dabbling with drugs. And I'm not going to be ashamed of the fact that Martha, I hate the way she died, of course, but that's not going to shame me into silence.
No, quite right. I think we're back to the grief is a cruel but very powerful motivator.
Yes, it is. And one day I will be able to just stop kind of talking about it, and just keep with the beautiful creative side of the love that I still have for her. Yeah, because, I spoke to somebody at a conference the other day and I said, listen, if I felt nothing was going on and there was progress wasn't being made, I wouldn't do this. Like I said, I'm very practical. I wouldn't waste my time. I know the context of how precious time is. I wouldn't waste my precious time. But the funny thing is, wherever we go now, on the train station platform the other day, a guy was chatting, saying, "Where are you guys going?" We told him it was to do with drug policy, and we didn't say it beyond that. And he said, "Well, in my opinion," and we braced ourselves waiting for the usual rhetoric. And he says, "It just needs to be regulated and taxed." And we were like, "Yes."
Oh, yeah.
So, and that's happening more and more. That never used to be the case. So word is getting through. It was like a few years ago, people didn't know what the word harm reduction meant. Now they understand it and they get why it's necessary. And the same with drug policy changes. So the ordinary person is wanting it, and they're sort of explaining it to us, and we're just sort of gleefully going, great, one day we won't have to do this and we can become obsolete as an organisation, which all charities should do.
Yeah, it's fantastic to know that things are changing and people understand the issue so much. I think so. That's so much better now. But it's thanks to the tireless campaigning of you guys. As you say, Jane, nowhere for people to go. NHS has been eroded so much that waiting lists are so long for any kind of support, therapy, that, so much more need to restore the NHS, but so much need for, and very sadly, an organisation like Anyone's Child, but how much you have achieved is really impressive and heartening. So plans for the future?
Plans for the future? Well, we're going to continue touring the country with our local events. We plan to grow the network of activists and families. I think for a lot of people, they assume that Anyone's Child is a network of people who are bereaved, and it actually in many ways has defaulted to slightly becoming that, which was really never its intention, if I'm entirely honest. I always thought, look, we just need to tell all the stories of how our drug policy is failing, because whether that be the disproportionate nature of stop and search on Black people, really important. There are many important stories within this failing policy. So I guess we're still working very sensitively to try and think about how best to bring on board some of these other stories. And I think it speaks again to the stigma, like some of the stories within drug policy are much harder to tell, even stories of criminalisation. If people are out of prison and rebuilding their life, to go back and reflect on that period, which is often they're quite ashamed of, or it was quite a challenging period, I think you can understand why we don't have lots of stories perhaps about so many bits of this, if that makes sense. And again, I know different communities have different levels of stigma around drug use. I think that's something we really need to understand. So again, diversifying the network to include more young people, more people of colour, and a wider variety of stories. I think as we watch ourselves getting our message out there, those stories will start to come in. We've never actually recruited for stories other than through things like this where we talk about it. And the families, when they do media, will generally clock the campaign as part of it. But we hope people will feel that their voices are important and can contribute to that change. So, yeah, that's what we're doing. And yeah, I think we need to continue to have conversations wherever we go with whoever we meet to bring on board, because you never quite know who you're talking to and where that influence will go. And I think these things change in funny ways. And whilst I'm not very positive about the next election, I don't think this is going to be an issue that runs. I hope I'm wrong on that. I do think that younger people understand this issue. I think there's a whole load of voters that our politicians will soon look at and go, you know what, actually maybe calling for changes to drug policy is actually a vote winner and not a vote loser that they fear. And I think we'll watch it switch very quickly when that time comes. We're just doing the groundwork now behind the scenes, and I am positive that we will flip this.
Oh yes, Jane, I'm very positive about that. So what about you, Anne-Marie? What's the future hold?
As Jane says, reaching into all communities. I'm quite obsessed with getting the young voice in the mix of things because they are being represented often without them. And I feel they have many of the answers, many of the insights with regards to what's it like to be a young person in 2023. So I think that's crucial in respect to our learning and our shaping of the project and in the shaping of the future of drug policy. I mean, we know county lines is a horrendous blight on the current system, and that keeps me awake at night, like that side of it, because at the event last week, they were talking about harm reduction for 6-year-olds, children that were taking Class C. So we really need to get this, sorted.
Absolutely. 6-year-olds. Good gracious. Gosh. Well, lots of we've run out of time. Sadly, I could talk to you guys all day. It's been brilliant. Absolutely brilliant. For our listeners, anyone's child is part of the Transform website. We'll put links to that in the show notes. There are stories on that, and I'd encourage you to listen to those stories. They're heartbreaking, but it's really those voices are so important. And any other information that Jane and Anne-Marie give us, we will put in the show notes. So I just want to say, finally, really a shout out to the new book I see has come out today, How to Regulate Psychedelics. That's taken a lot of work. Steve Rills from Transform, and that's a focus on non-medical use of psychedelics, and the great work that Transform do. And as Jane would say, I think write to your MP.
Yes, please write to your MP. We've got template letters available on our website and information about our activist network. So if you do want to get more involved, please do. And as always, we're looking for new ways to fund it. I think that's going to be a new pressure for this year. So any thoughts around that, we'd welcome them.
So any uber rich people listening and want to donate would be very useful. We're clearly very worthwhile donating. So thank you both. That's been the most wonderful hour. I've learned an awful lot and uplifted by all the work that you're doing and the progress that you're making. So thank you very much again.
Thank you, Jo.
Thanks, Jo.